we have so many new Marvel Snap cards to talk about today because the latest patch landed yesterday, and with it a bunch of new data mined cards. We're gonna take a look at 13 upcoming cards, I think, in this video today, which is crazy, maybe the most ever. We're gonna talk about them all in great detail, talk about the decks they might fit into, how powerful they're gonna be, and I'm gonna rank them from best to worst. Now, that said, these all could still get changed. These are data mines, they're early looks, they are not final cards. These days, they tend to be closer to the final version than they used to be in the past, but certainly numbers can change, and even occasionally some text could change as well. But these are generally a good preview of at least the directionality and often just exactly what the card is going to look like. So let's go ahead and kick things off here with what I think could be actually the strongest card of this entire batch, and also just looks super sick. This is Weapon H. And I had no idea this is a character, but it's like a Hulk with Wolverine claws and an adamantium skeleton, and I am like 100% in on how cool this is. And I should also say this whole batch is going to be like Weapon X themed cards. It's basically Marvel Snap goes to Canada, I think, for the Marvel Universe. I'm going to get Alex Kocha on the phone. He's going to be pumped. But Weapon H here is a big old 714 that reads, when discarded, put this back with -2 cost, which 14 power, number one, great, nice, big number. Each time this disc gets discarded, going down by 2 means you've got a 514 after a single discard on this, which is actually already like, that's nuts. That's crazy for a 5-drop. 2 discards makes this a 314, which is just obscene. Another discard, you get down to 114, and of course this could actually also go down to 0. I think getting it to 0 is going to feel a little tough or awkward. But in particular, you know, getting this down to 3 seems incredibly trivial because, like, turn 4, you play Lady Sif into Blade, boom, you've got a 314 just like that. Turn 5, you play MODOK, boom, you've got a 114 in hand just like that, which is completely, totally nuts to me. There's also stuff like Corvus Glaive you could put in the mix as well. You know, it could occasionally hit your Weapon H, give you that extra energy that then allows you to maybe play like a 114 Weapon H and, like, I don't know, a 16 power Apocalypse or something for this nutty 1-2 punch on the final turn. So, like, look, I don't know exactly how this fits into typical discard decks right now, because there are just like some curve considerations. Like, do you want to lean more into Dracula Apocalypse? Do you want to lean more into like Dakin Bullseye stuff, right? But ultimately, I think it doesn't matter. I think this card's actually powerful enough. The discounts here are crazy enough that you could just see the entire package shift towards this and focus on actually making this card playable and good. And from a curve consideration standpoint, you know, find scenarios where if this gets to 3, you can line something up nicely with it. If it gets to 1, you can line something up nicely with it on the final turn. But I could imagine kind of like an all-in like discard reward deck where you just have a lot of things that like getting discarded. So, you know, Swarms and Wolverines and X-23s. We're going to see another new card in this video that just likes getting discarded, Proxima Midnight, whatever, right? And kind of go half in on that, half in on the actual discards, have some of those bigger ones like Corvus Glaive and MODOK, and just like maybe on the final turn, you know, you dump 4 Swarms, you dump a Weapon H, you dump an Apocalypse, maybe even dump a Scorn that has been buffed. And it's just this like crazy, unpredictable power dump on the final turn. That just sounds really, really good to me. So I don't think it takes much to make this card competitive, and I really don't think it takes much to make this card like completely insane and busted. So therefore, I think this card is going to be really, really strong. All right, so that was Weapon H. This is Weapon X, or of course Wolverine, as we all know him. Yet another version of a character that has been a variant, but will now also be its own unique card, which I actually don't mind this. I think they should have done this from the beginning. I even kind of remember some stubborn answers in the past where they were like, no, you know, if it's the same person, we're not going to make them a unique individual card. That always seemed limiting to me. I like this spin on it better, but it does feel weird now that we've got like Weapon X variants for Wolverine. So, you know, if they'd done this from the start, I think it would have been pretty cool. It does feel a little odd these days, but I know some people want all new characters, which I understand that logic too. Anyway, totally an aside. This is Weapon X, a new 2/1 destroy synergy card here. This reads, after one of your other cards is destroyed, +1 power. So you put this down and it starts scaling whenever other cards get destroyed. Now note it is your other cards, not enemy cards, but still you can imagine, you know, throw down a squirrel, throw down a Weapon X, throw down a Killmonger, and like this is already a 2/4, and then you just go from there, right? And if you have some other 1-drops, X-23, Moira, Uncle Ben, whatever, right? One Killmonger could basically buff this thing like 6 or 7 power at one stage of the game, make this like, you know, a little bit of a powerhouse of its own. Then you've got maybe like a Null, and then you have Death, which is another great way to pay off all of those small tokens dying. So, you know, instead of a kind of a destroy deck that's focusing in on making like 1 or 2 key big things like a Deadpool, you could instead have more of a token wide board destroy deck that's about the quantity of the things destroyed, not the quality of the things destroyed. And this would give you another angle on that. So Null, Death, Weapon X could become like the trio in that deck. Now, I didn't even finish reading the text, for God's sake. After every 3rd time that a card is destroyed, improve this effect by 1. So in other words, if you play that squirrel on turn 1, play this on 2, you Killmonger that squirrel, you're going to increment up Weapon X's buff so that any future cards destroyed get +2 power. So suddenly it's like, holy crap, this went to a 2/4, and now the next round of 3 destroys, like this is going to gain another 6. It's going to go up +2 every time, goes up to 10. You know, I think it's going to actually feel kind of possible to get this thing up to 10, 12, 14 and beyond because of some of those like token strategies we talked about where you're just going wide. You could maybe even do stuff like Squirrel Girl and Weapon X and Shauna and Killmonger, you know, and just go absolutely nuts on it. You know, you also have the classic Venoms and Carnages and so on, where it's like, how far could you actually push this thing? How many times can you increment this effect? Can you get him up to +3 per hit, +4 per hit? That seems like pretty out of range, honestly. I think getting like, you know, another +4 or +6 out of the second round of +2 powers is going to feel like enough to make it worth it. Anything beyond that will just be crazy bonuses, you know. Like I said, get this up to 210. I think you're pretty happy at the end of the day. Feels like it's in that range of stuff like, you know, Collector, maybe not quite as big as a Morbius sometimes, but some Morbiuses are around that size too. I think that would feel like a competitive spot. So I do actually see this being pretty good, just shifting that style of deck a little bit. We've seen some stuff like Thanos, Death in that world, you know, play all the stones down, maybe weave in a Mockingbird, wipe out all your stones, then you've got a Death or a Null follow-up or whatever. Maybe Weapon X would go in that. Maybe it's all in on your own token death stuff, token destroy stuff, but I do see some angles on that. I don't know if this quite gets there in a regular destroy list where you're just doing more straightforward Deadpool and Carnage and Venom stuff. There would be some games where it probably felt okay because you can still, you know, cycle through 4 or 5 things that you're destroying, particularly like Moira X, giving you a lot of cheap bodies to throw down. But I don't know if it would be quite as decisive. I'll also note this does need to be on board for all of that to happen, so you do kind of need to play it earlier, which can push the curve back a little bit for a normal destroy deck, could maybe make things awkward because you don't want to end up playing it too late. And the great thing about Killmonger is he's decisive and does it all at once, right? So you can kind of catch up and just really hit this, as opposed to meeting that out with 1 or 2 destroy effects over time might be harder. So I do think you probably go in a different direction for this one, but I think it's powerful enough that it could make that work. And I think you could almost see like 2 different lines for destroy decks, which is pretty sick. All right, speaking of cheap stuff to destroy, this is Wade Wilson. Speaking of, I guess, alternate versions of characters, how many Deadpools do we have now with Wade Wilson? This is a 2/2, and it reads, when destroyed, replace this with a 1-cost card from your hand or deck with +1 power, which that immediately jumps to mind, of course, as a Deadpool tutor effect, where if you don't happen to have Deadpool in hand, you're a Deadpool deck, you want to cheat him into play, Wade Wilson could be a really good way to do that. It also gives him a nice little +1 buff so that you start his scaling on top of that. Now, you know, that's interesting because, of course, Deadpool can be a really powerful effect for those destroy effects. I have a question, though, that if you're playing this on 2, you're probably not destroying this very often until turn 3. It's possible, you know, like Nico into Wade or whatever, but probably destroying this on turn 3, which means you're not going to start destroying your Deadpool often until turn 4, because you then want to follow up again on the Deadpool. Again, there's ways to do it, but the natural curve would be like Sudlam hitting that Deadpool on turn 4, and then on turn 5. That means your Deadpool is probably going to go from 2 to 4 on turn 4, and then from 4 to 8 on turn 5. 8 power Deadpool is not that like crazy value that you want, you know, and you may not even get a good Venom out of it to kind of double down on those stats. So in other words, using this to do the Deadpool thing, it might come along a little too late to actually be that great with Deadpool. Something like Headpool is, of course, another option. You got some variety there. Maybe that fits a little bit better in some worlds. It doesn't have to like scale up over time as much. It can kind of be good all at once, just hitting 3 or 4 things in hand and playing those 3 or 4 things. So certainly not limited to only Deadpool, but you know, that might be the most obvious choice because this is literally Deadpool, but you know, just also the one drop that Destroy decks care about. So I don't know. I'm like a little bit torn on this. I think if this was a one drop in particular, the timing window on it would feel dramatically better than with a two drop, because you could just like Carnage on turn 2 or whatever, use a Killmonger to sweep this up a little more easily. But as a two drop in particular, it feels like sometimes the payoff might not be worth it. Now, there are other ways to maybe pay this off, right? You don't necessarily have to just like use it as a tutor to find your thing. You could theoretically just put big one drops in your deck and use this almost like a Bucky Barnes or something of sorts, right? Where it's like Ebony Maw's in the deck, I destroy Wade Wilson, I summon the Ebony Maw. Now, again, Ebony Maw's got some restrictions. You get the idea. You probably just rather run the Bucky Barnes than that, but it is at least a possibility. There's also a conversation about like how many one drops in your deck, because if you're trying to find specifically Deadpool, then you know you can't have other one drops in your deck because this might pull a different one instead. Like you wouldn't though also want only one drop in your deck, because then sometimes this would be a totally dead card that does absolutely nothing, right? I mean, I guess it works in hand too, so you know there'd always be a little window, but it might feel wasted in essence. If I already have the Deadpool in hand, I don't really need to find it. You could just play it and not have to go through this extra step of the Wade Wilson, this like extra overhead or whatever with the 2 energy here. It's maybe worth a little because you can get, you know, an extra destroy body down, etc. Advance your death, advance your null, but it'd be worth very, very little in that regard. So I guess what I'm getting at is ultimately, I feel like this card just has some like awkwardness and timing issues baked into it. The upside on it to me does not really feel worth enough. If it gave the 1-cost card a more notable buff, maybe even like, I think it could go up to like +3 power. That might be kind of interesting and nice. If it only worked on deck, in some ways that would almost be better too, because you could like shorten your deck a little bit and make sure that your deck's always a little bit smaller to make it more likely you find other things. But the fact that if you have something in deck or one in hand and you want to get the one from deck, but you might actually get the one from hand instead, like that can create some little weirdness too, where it's like, oh, Deadpool's in deck, Headpool's in hand. I really wanted Deadpool. I didn't want to just pull Headpool into play. You can control that a little bit if you play it out, but you might not have mana, energy. For instance, if it's like turn 3, you got Venom or Deathlock, you don't have room to play the Headpool and guarantee your result as easily. So I know I'm not doing a great job of explaining all this, so at least I don't feel like I am, but in essence, it's just got some awkwardness, and I think that's really going to be a limiter for Wade Wilson. I think it's going to be hard to make this work in a compelling way. I think it needs to either be cheaper or have a bigger buff to really feel as impactful as it should. All right, moving on over to Marrow, which for some reason is a character I know really well, but I don't know what from. Was she in the old X-Men animated cartoon a lot or something? I don't know how I know her. Maybe I had a toy again, but I always had a fondness for this character. It is a 2/3 that reads, when discarded or destroyed, randomly split -6 power among enemy cards. So this is another one of those cards that, like X-23 and Wolverine, is going to have double duty for both discard and destroy decks. Now, we've really very rarely seen Wolverine or X-23 really take any spotlights in discard decks. They've pretty much been restricted to destroy decks, which I always thought was a little sad. I think there's space to explore those more than people have in discard as just like, you know, free stats. Like they're just totally free when you discard them and you get the stats, which is great. Stats without energy is incredibly efficient. And Marrow is going to be an even more efficient way to get stats without energy, because she's basically a 0/6 if you discard her, right? Just -6 is not bigger than even a Wolverine, right? He's kind of a 0/5 if you discard him. Proxima Midnight obviously is a 0/7 when you discard her. So this is like kind of competing with Proxima Midnight in a weird way. So I again would kind of like to explore an all-in discard deck that has a lot of these kind of targets with stuff like this where it just pays off your discards. And, you know, we talked about our buddy Weapon H already, kind of in that same space. I think there's something intriguing there. There's also, you know, using this as a destroy body as well, you know, just toss this in as another cheap way to get some stats for a destroy deck that maybe doesn't lock up space on your side of the board, which could be interesting. Or if it somehow cared a little bit about affliction, which, you know, obviously this is, you know, negative power, so affliction decks could maybe utilize this, but I don't think we have a lot of affliction destroy synergies at the moment that really fuse together. There's like some Dormammu doing that as well, but in other words, like high evo destroy abomination, I don't think's a thing. But I will say, like, this could just hit 6 cards all on its own, which would make abomination immediately jump to 0. That's an intriguing idea. Like, this is just such a wide spread of affliction potentially, and, you know, depending on when it happens, because I mean, I have 6 bodies on board, I wouldn't totally write that off, to be honest. But I think ultimately just, whether it's in a destroy deck spending 2 for 6 power, or even more to my style, a discard deck spending 0 potentially for -6 power on the opponent's side of the board, this can just be a really efficient stat output and can do some cool stuff. I'll also say there's something cool with this. With a lot of the cards where you want to discard them, they remove themselves from the discard pool. So, Wolverine, Apoc, Scorn, etc. They don't stay in the discard pool. So once, that might be part of the reason they're not as widely utilized. Marrow actually stays in the discard pool. So you could actually still resurrect her off a Hela or a Khonshu or something while still benefiting from her discard effect, which I don't know exactly which implications that has right now, but I'm sure there's some world and somewhere where that's actually relevant and becomes kind of interesting. Maybe a Hela deck is just fine to bring back a 2/3. Maybe it has some destroy synergies in the mix as well or something. Or maybe it's just like, hey, I got my -6 and I get a bonus 3. Like, sure, that's totally fine for me. I got 9 power out of this 2-drop in my Hela deck. It's not impossible that actually kind of makes sense. So at the end of the day, I do actually like this card a lot. I think it has pretty efficient numbers and surprising amount of ways that it could actually get played, including perhaps an Affliction deck, which is sort of wild. Next up is Fantomex. This is a 4/6 with an activate that's going to combine discard and destroy stuff together. Like Marrow, X23, Wolverine, like we talked about. This reads activate if you've had cards discarded and destroyed. So both. You got to have both. You have to have discarded something and destroyed something. Afflict front row enemy cards at each location with -2 power. So basically, if you're building your deck across destroy and discard, and you somehow get a few of those things going together, you might only need 1 destroy or 1 discard for the record to activate your Fantomex. But if you do that, if you build a successful deck that has fused those 2 worlds together, this is a really big payoff because he's a 4/6 at a baseline, already respectable. And then he's basically able to afflict all 3 locations with -4 total power if they have, multiple front row cards, which means, that's another plus, plus 12. My God. Yeah. 4, 4, and 4 in total output, which means this is a 4/18 if everything lines up and they have all those cards. Not to mention, of course, Affliction can have additional upsides. You hit their Captain Carter or whatever, right? You're even more happy that you've hit that Affliction. That's worth even more points. So you're talking about a 4/18 with upside, which is like a ridiculous total stat output. And with Activate, you can also just wait until the end of the game to make it far more likely they have cards in all those slots, which most decks would very often. Maybe one spot only has 1 card. Maybe they duck a spot altogether, but that means you've won that for free anyway because they're scared away by Fantomex, right? So, ultimately, I think very easy for this to be a 4/14, 4/16, 4/18 with additional upside. Now, I say very easy, but, once you've gotten the deck together, I don't know how easy it's going to actually be to make a cohesive deck that's doing all of those things reliably. But I don't think it's nuts to just, toss in X23, Wolverine, Marrow, Fantomex. Maybe you just run like 1 Carnage, 1 Venom. Venom's great in particular with decks like this because he can just lock in the stats anyway. He's not really much of a sacrifice. He's enough to get you on your Fantomex. He's enough to sometimes activate a Marrow, roll a Wolverine for another roll, right? And like suddenly, I think it kind of works, man. I think this card actually has big enough numbers that it could really be the actual reason that this deck gets there. We're going to take a look at one more card here. I also just teased accidentally by clicking too soon. Wild Child. This is a 2/1 with ongoing +4 power if you've discarded and +4 power if one of your cards has been destroyed. So this is yet another payoff, fusing those 2 worlds together and bringing that home, which Fantomex might have been reason enough. Wild Child is basically a 2/9 that might be even more reason to do so. So really high potential card. Let's now also talk about Wild Child. As I said, this is a 2/1 with ongoing +4 power if you've discarded a card and +4 power if one of your cards has been destroyed. So, is this worth it in either of those worlds independently? Nah, I don't think so, right? Like a 2/5 is actually not terrible for a record if you just toss them into a discard deck, but worse than Morbius. I always get these confused. +4 power if one of your cards has been destroyed. Like you'd rather have the Weapon X in your deck, destroying lots of things if you're looking for a 2-drop scaler, right? So never good enough in either of those worlds independently. But as soon as you fuse those two worlds together, a 2/9, it's pretty great, man. That's really efficient for a 2-drop, and it shouldn't be hard to do if your deck is, reliably trying to achieve this game plan. You assume it's happening every game, and the fact that it's ongoing, you don't have to play this down early. You can slam it on turn 6 or whatever, and still have a really nice, surprising splash of power. So, I actually think that both of these cards are so strong. This deck gets there. I think you're going to see Fantomex Wild Child decks that have, Wolverine and all these guys and Marrow and stuff. And they're going to be putting out some big numbers. I think they're going to be super competitive. They could maybe even have a little bit of affliction stuff going on too, because both Fantomex and Marrow have some affliction cards. I don't know if you try to squeeze in a third archetype, you might just take that power for what it is, some like disruptive power on your opponent that messes up Captain Carter's, messes up C2 decks or whatever, right? You just be happy as is. Maybe you could toss in a High Evo Abomination, but I don't think you need it. I think this is just great. Again, very narrow. It's not going to make sense anywhere else. It's only going to be in that one deck, but that might just be kind of the start of an entirely new archetype of sorts that is fusing these two other archetypes together. So moving on here to the Fastball Special. This is another kind of destroy and affliction hybrid. This is a 2-mana collectible skill, referencing, of course, Wolverine getting thrown by Colossus, the Fastball Special, always fun. On reveal, destroy your highest power card here to afflict an enemy card here with that much negative power, which actually pretty cool, right? You do stuff like make a really big Venom, right? You love Venom because he gets to lock in a lot of stats while still doing things like scaling up your null, basically, right? It's like, oh, I get to kind of go 2 for 1 on this. We often see that with Deadpool, for instance. Well, now Fastball Special actually becomes a really neat follow-up on top of that, where it's like, hey, I just made this really big Venom. Guess what? I can do it again. I can lock in these stats again by sending them over to the opponent as negative stats. I made a 12 power Venom, and now I'm gonna, let's say a 16 power Venom. He's a big boy, right? Now I give the opponent negative 16. I'm way ahead in this spot because they've got so much negative power, and I just made my null 16 points bigger. Right, you get to go 2 for 1. This also is like a fine activator for something like a Deadpool. It's like, hey, I made this 32 power Deadpool or whatever. Hey, take a chill negative 32 off my Deadpool. Hey, guess what? Now I have a 64 power Deadpool in hand, right? Those moments are going to happen where this is like kind of a Venom that's just cheaper in a weird way, right? It does the same thing. Now, Venom is nice because it hits multiple bodies. This only hits one thing, but we just talked about 2 very reliable ways to do that in a destroy deck where you're already fine just hitting the one big guy because Venom's already condensed the stats down for you, or Deadpool's just so freaking big that it works anyway, right? So it becomes, again, this really, really strong follow-up, I think, for a destroy deck. So I don't think you need like affliction stuff again. I think you just take the affliction as is. You're happy with it. But I like this a lot. I honestly think this card is super strong. Could be a staple in destroy decks, which we don't normally see these collectible skills really jumping out as a staple just yet. But this might be the first one. I think this looks very powerful, particularly for only 2 energy. All right, next up we have another collectible skill here with some destroy applications. This is the Adamantium Infusion. This time around 4 energy, so notably more expensive. On reveal, revive your highest power destroyed card here with its power doubled. So I just talked about destroying a giant Venom with your Fastball Special, locking in those stats, right? Well, now guess what? You get to bring your Venom back with its power doubled. So if you made that 15 power Venom, 16 power Venom, whatever, and send it over, boom, you got a 32 power Venom right back with Adamantium Infusion. Now, do keep in mind the word revive does have some implications in Marvel Snap with stuff like Deadpool. You can't revive a Deadpool because he's already been returned to hand. He's not in the destroy pool. It has to be something specifically that was in the destroy pool. So some of those cards like Wolverines and Deadpools and stuff that get added back to hand wouldn't work, but some do, right? Like we said, destroy your Venom and you're happy, man. Just go right there. There is also some world where you could like use this as a counter or something of sorts to, like a Shang-Chi or whatever outside of a destroy deck. Like, hey, you're going to destroy my biggest guy. No, you're not. Just kidding. I'm going to bring it back. You could also use this in a kind of like offshoot of destroy. We've seen some of these or we've made, I guess I should say, what I call like big Venom decks where, you play like Starbrand and then you play Call Obsidian, and then you Venom them to lock in those stats, right? And then you go like, Arnim Zola to copy the big Venoms or whatever. And then you could use a card like Adamantium Infusion to bring back the big Venom. Or maybe, you're just happy bringing back the doubled Call Obsidian, and you get, kind of a 420 off of your Adamantium Infusion. As long as you're just destroying something big, it's not hard to make this, feel like a really big efficient power output for only 4 energy. So in a weird way, I don't know if I love this so much in a traditional destroy deck. I don't know if it fits quite as well in my mind as something like Fastball Special, which I think you could slot right into Deadpool Destroy and just be super happy with I think it just fits perfectly, right? This I think is a little more awkward. 4 energy is harder to work with. Finding a moment for this is kind of weird. It's kind of card I think you'd often want to play like on turn 5 or something, or turn 6, excuse me, but you're wanting to play Null. Maybe that's just more power output. So I don't know. You might have to really shift the list to make sense for this, do something a little bit different. There are some worlds where, this is just really big numbers though. So I absolutely wouldn't write this off. I think you could have kind of like a niche little tier 2 thing where it's doing some specific game plan, but you're just making a giant guy out of it, right? And there might even be some cool ways to make, destroy a Black Panther and make it even bigger and crazy, right? All sorts of weird little stuff like that. Are always possible, because you got like, you could do Kid Omega on 2, Black Panther on turn 5, Adamantium Infusion on turn 6. Maybe you got a Magic and you Arnim Zola, it might be too many steps. You might just be better off with like Wong or Symbiote Spider-Man or whatever. But there are things like that are always possible, particularly with Kid Omega making some potentially really, really big stuff. Maybe even like Tribunal or something could come into the mix, right? So maybe not as clear of a vision for me as like a tier 1 deck or a proven archetype necessarily, just from a curve standpoint, timing standpoint. Might be hard to line all that up, but I do see some angles with little offshoots basically where this feels like it could do some really big things, because doubling big stuff is really big. All right, so moving on to Aurora. This is like a sick card. I'm really excited to see this. Aurora is a new 6/5. I just love seeing 6 drops, by the way. We don't get enough, I feel like. I like big cards. She has this on reveal. Give one of your other on reveal cards at each location +2 power, but then also repeat for ongoing, activate, and end of turn. So this is, I guess, really, as far as I can tell, Marvel Snap's first like menagerie card, as we might call it in, for instance, Hearthstone, where you're trying to blend together multiple types of things into one deck. So, having some on reveal and activate and end of turn and ongoing, blending it all up together and having this huge payoff with Aurora. Because basically for each of these keywords, she can net +6 power, right? So 1 on reveal at each location, that's +2, +2, +2. 1 ongoing at each location, +2, +2, +2. 1 activated at each location, +2, +2, +2. Now she does occupy a spot herself, so I guess you can't fully maximize end of turn. She can't buff herself as an on reveal, or you'd be missing one. But I guess you could theoretically get 11 total buffs out of this card for 22 total power out of your Aurora, making her in effect a 627, which Spectrum does actually often compete with that. I think Spectrum very often hits 8, 9 buffs, right, if you're going all in on ongoing. So in a weird way, I don't actually know if this is like competitive enough, because you're probably sacrificing a little bit already to split your deck so many ways, because like a lot of these cards synergize with each other, ongoing synergizing with ongoing, and so on, activate with activate, etc. So it's like, I almost think this card could stand to be a little bigger, or actually give a bigger buff than she does. I mean, a 6/5 that gives like +2, +2, +2 for on reveal cards alone, you start looking and you're like, well, it's not that far off from like Doctor Doom. It doesn't take much, just like a couple on reveals, couple end of turns, you've got yourself like a Doctor Doom. But I think she might actually need to be a little bit more competitive. So I love this from a design standpoint. Like, I think it's really fun to try to build out a deck list that combines all of these things in a really compelling way and actually can win games, maybe without Aurora sometimes, but just being sure to really lean into that. There's certain stuff too that like cares about stat buffs. You have end of turn cards like Human Torch, First Steps, that cares about stat buffs. Then you have stuff like Captain Carter for ongoing that cares about stat buffs, and activate stuff like Scarlet Spider that cares about stat buffs. You could kind of set all of that up where you finish with an Aurora that helps her feel more significant, because unlike just a base +2 or whatever from a Spectrum or something, you start magnifying those buffs through all the other cards' individual effects. and it starts to add up. So maybe you don't need to hit 11 buffs on Aurora, maybe just, you know, 2 key here buffs there, 2 key here buffs, 2 key buffs here or there is what I'm trying to say, start to add up and stack up into something really powerful potentially, which I think does become pretty interesting. So I don't know, like, it's just a really big deck building challenge. I wish the numbers were a little bigger or a little easier to achieve, but I do think that buff angle in particular could be what sets this apart. That's probably where you have to go. I do ultimately feel like it's going to be just a hair weak, but that is not an indictment on the design, because I'm beyond excited to try to do this. I think a really cool deck building challenge, and probably still gets there in a lot of ways. I bet we'll build again like a solid positive win rate deck. Maybe this doesn't jump to like tier 1 right away or anything, but I bet it's still a pretty solid deck, because I think just the few cards I described already I can see the vision a little bit there already. And speaking of activate cards you might want to buff here, we've got Maverick, a new 3/3 with activate. Give the next card you play power equal to this card's power. So if you get this sucker buffed up a little bit, man, you can really, again, start magnifying those stats with an additional +3 baked in. So, you know, hit this with an Ironheart, it's a 3/6, and then boom, you get to give 6 power bonus to something right away, right? That would make this a total output of 9 power, 3 at its baseline, and then +6 extra on top of something else, because you've, you know, increased those bonus stats. I could actually see this being run in something like a Namora deck pretty well, where you play Namora to buff this up to a 3/8 really quickly, maybe Wong Namora to push it even further. It is a little weird with that activate timing, because it's like if you're using your final card to buff this again, in that example, like if you played an Odin to give this an additional +20, you wouldn't be able to give Odin +20, because you'd have to activate after the Odin to get those stats, and then there wouldn't be anything left. Maybe you could like finish with a Wasp or something in that deck, and then buff a Wasp by like +33 or whatever you get this up to in a Namora deck. That would actually be pretty sick. The Wasp tech at the end would be cool. I like running Wasp in those decks anyway. So, okay, I'm actually sold. That's actually such a sick idea. I'm going to do that right away. There might be more honest ways to do this too. Stuff we talked about like Ironheart and so on. Might be a way to just like make this okay. Silver Surfer has that same kind of problem where usually you want to play your Surfer last. So it's like, you know, if you buff this with Surfer a couple times, then you might not have another body post Surfer where it feels good to hit. So there is just some timing issues with activate if you're using this as your last card. Aurora, same story, right? Like you'd play the Aurora to buff this, but then, you know, you couldn't buff the Aurora again unless you had another card after that. So a little bit of weirdness there, but I think ultimately this is just another efficient stat multiplier, which I like these cards a lot. We've seen a lot of them. They do sometimes work well in Surfer decks too. You know, just use this with a Brood in a Surfer deck. You might not need anything else. If you just think about this like a Forge, you may not actually have to buff it, but if you multiply it on the other end and just use this as like a 3-cost Forge or something, then, you know, okay, I'm kind of sold again. You know, I just give my Brood +3, I'm kind of getting the other side. This is not only a follow-up, but it's also a buffer. So there's kind of 2 directions. You can actually Forge into Maverick into Brood if you wanted to have some weird curve fits, right? There's all kinds of little things that are possible. So what I'm getting at is I actually like this. I think it can scale stats really well and could make some big time plays. And I'm very excited to do that Wasp thing. That sounds super fun. All right, next up here is Chamber. This is a crazy card. 2/3 with activate +2 power for each 5-cost or higher card you have here and in hand. So if you have a deck with some big stuff, right, 5 drops and 6 drops, stuff like a ramp deck comes to mind, theoretically a Hella deck, although you're discarding those, so that actually feels a little bit worse. But you know, just any big stuff deck, then this guy can just be a free way to gain, I think +4, +6, maybe even more than that's not crazy for some decks. And the good news is too, you can like activate it early, so you play this on 2 and you still have 3 or 4 big cards in hand. Might be pretty easy to just make this a 2/11 in a ramp deck real quick, which honestly is kind of worth it. Now, like, ramp decks aren't historically the most successful right now, or historically really. There's been a few moments ramp decks are like kind of competitive, but you know, hard to be at the top of the meta in a ramp deck. And if you look at like normal deck lists, most of them just don't run that many 5s and 6s. Like most decks, a lot of decks don't even have any. Some decks have like 1 or 2. Maybe there's some stuff like Discard that has a Khonshu and an Apocalypse and a Modok in hand, you know, but I wouldn't think this would outcompete the other cards in a Discard deck. So I don't think this is one that you can just toss into a lot of decks. I think you really have to kind of focus in on this and like build the deck towards this as some kind of ramp deck or whatever. But man, sometimes those decks just need early stuff to do. They might prefer leaning in for only ramp cards for the early cards. They might just not have space for something like this, but I wouldn't totally write it off as just, you know, a quick 211. It's just, you know, really narrow, really niche. There aren't going to be a lot of decks that want to use this. Those decks may not actually be good, so it might just kind of be held down by its deck fit and never feel like a particularly competitive card. But I don't think a 2-9 or a 2-11 is bad at the end of the day. I think we're probably going to build a ramp deck where this feels pretty big and pretty nice and surprises people just how much power it gets out. So for that reason, I don't actually hate this. All right, next up here we have Chameleon. This is one I teased last time we did leaked cards. We didn't have the art yet. I like wait until we get that full art. This is a 3/3 that reads, on reveal, copy the text of another card here that you revealed this turn. So actually a cheap way to potentially copy some really powerful text. You know, this is not only copying on reveal stuff, just means the card itself was revealed this turn. So you could copy, for instance, an Iron Man and get a cheap 3-cost Iron Man. Just do keep in mind that's an 8 energy play because this has to be played the same turn as the thing you want to copy, which will sometimes just be the limiter for some of those really high value effects. Like it's actually really hard to play this with Iron Man. Sure, Mr. Negative deck could do it. Maybe you could toss this in as a way to copy some awesome stuff from Mr. Negative. There's also the note that this has to be played in the same location, which sometimes might feel like a waste, like you're doubling down, you're overcommitting to a certain spot. So a couple like checks in place on this one right away. Just weaving it into the turn can be tough. The kind of positioning or overcommitment can be tough. The timing can be tough as well, because, you know, it's like I always kind of imagining this on turn 6 because you need max energy, which means this card's probably often very dead earlier. Like you can't play it on turn 3 unless you want to copy a wasp or something, right? Like not a lot of upside there. So even on turn 5, right, you're only copying like a 2 energy thing typically. So outside of some discounts or cheese, it's a little awkward and difficult to actually get this to copy what you want. The one, though, perfect example that might just save this card all on its own, you might not need anything else, is just playing this with Silver Surfer on turn 6. Whether that's with Sarah or otherwise, it's actually just a great way to line up 2 Silver Surfers in a Silver Surfer deck. That could actually just be enough. It's like, hey, man, I don't need anything else. Just give me 2 Surfers and I'm really happy. I think that's actually kind of viable. I think it's going to be really hard and awkward to use this card anywhere else. It's going to be just tough to line it up and fit it in and stuff, but I like it in Silver Surfer. There might be an issue that it's like hard to play at any other stage in the Silver Surfer deck. You could maybe do something like turn 5, you play Forge into Chameleon, and then turn 6, you play like Brood into Surfer, and you know, the Brood is buffed by the Chameleon, but it's like, I didn't really do anything, right? Like it's not really, you just could have just played any other 3-drop and then the Forge, right? It's like, it doesn't, you know, it's not like scaling those stats or anything off the Forge effect. So I don't know. I'm sure there's some little 2-drops that it makes sense with, but a lot of the times it's just going to be an only turn 6 kind of play. And I do think that's going to feel restrictive, maybe even in a Silver Surfer deck, honestly. But if your Surfer deck is built with enough buff targets, you got a Brood, you got a Captain Carter or whatever, you might not need much more than 2 Surfers as your perfect follow-up. And therefore probably an out for this card that's going to save its ranking in this video, even though I think 97% of the time it's going to be pretty awkward. And then our final card here is Dragon Man. It looks like there's going to be like a dragon themed season coming later. This is the only one I think we have an effect for so far in the data mines though. Dragon Man is a 4/4 with end of turn +2 power for each location that's full on your side. So kind of that Dazzler style effect where you want to fill out the board, also kind of leaning into the, I guess, like prehistoric stuff. I don't know much about this character, but makes sense with like Zoo, Kazar, Shauna sorts of things where you're loading up the board. Because in this case in particular, you want to load up the board ASAP, right? This is a end of turn effect. So in theory, like, yeah, maybe you just want to wait until turn 6 so that you don't lock up the board too quickly, and you maybe only take 1 end of turn of this, and you're happy to get, you know, +6 power out of your Dragon Man. He's a 4/10 that you play on turn 6. Probably not a disaster, not the most exciting thing ever, but maybe it's okay with 1 end of turn loop. Maybe you've got some other end of turn synergies, Invisible Woman, and so on in the mix to help this out, but maybe that's okay. I think it's more exciting though if you do get an extra cycle or 2 out of this. You know, you fill out 1 spot on turn 4, with Dragon Man. So that's like, you still have some scaling there, maybe especially because you're going to play, Blue Marvel later and add even more points or whatever. And then suddenly, he might get an extra +2, so he goes up to +6. And then on turn 5, he gets another +2, so he's up to 8. And then you fill out on turn 6, and he jumps another 6, and he's suddenly a 414 in that instance instead of just a 410. That starts to make that number look a little bit more exciting and compelling. And the fact that, you're not locked into your scaling in that locked in spot might be nice. There's also ways to use this with stuff, like move package, like we've seen with Angela and Scarlet Witch this week. Put in a Jeff, Nightcrawler, or whatever, move them out later if you need to add power, but temporarily fill the location in essence so the Dragon Man gets some scaling. All that's pretty cool. I will just say it is 4 costs and it's like kind of high commitment, and some scenarios and board states and killmongers and a lot of stuff could really limit the reach on this one. I kind of wish this was a 4-6 at a baseline, so it just had that little bit of extra edge if things didn't go perfectly, because I don't think getting up to like a 4-16 in that kind of ideal scenario we described is too much. And I certainly don't think it's going to be easy to fill out multiple locations by turn 4 where this is scaling a lot earlier, and you don't usually ever want to lock out a game on turn 5 or whatever to give this crazy numbers. So at the end of the day, I guess what I mean is, like, I think it's okay. I think it can get big, but it might just create some really locked in game plans that are too restrictive, too risky, and ultimately cause more problems than that slightly over efficient power is really worth. It's not like so big that it's but I just want to play Cole Obsidian. Like, I just like Cole Obsidian better. He's more reliable, more trustworthy. I don't really know if I need this, and I don't really know if this is enough for end of turn decks either, instead of the kind of zoo package, because they don't always want to fill out locations as easily, number 1, but number 2, it's like they just already have a lot of good end of turn scaling. This does not seem to outpace that in my mind. All right, so all that said, my God, there's so many cards. Let's rank these from best to worst. My number 1 card is Weapon H. Number 2 is Fastball Special. Number 3 is Weapon X. Number 4 is Fantomex. Number 5 is Marrow. Number 6 is Wild Child. Number 7 is Aurora. Number 8 is Maverick. Number 9 is Adamantium Infusion. Number 10 is Chamber. Number 11 is Chameleon. Number 12 is Dragon Man. Number 13 is Wade Wilson. And yeah, there you go, folks. That is all the cards. Weapon H just looks so sick. I just need to read about this character, dude. This looks awesome. I love dudes like this. Just like big, crazy, scary, just like such a sick combination. Like, this is like a thumbnail, I guess is why it's like literally one of my thumbnails where I'm fusing 2 characters together. They just did it officially. What am I gonna do for this thumbnail? It's already Wolverine and Hulk together. I don't know what to do. Maybe I turn him green or give him, I don't know, Wolverine's color. I don't even know, dude. They just did the job for me. Maybe that's why I love it so much, but it's so sick looking. Anyway, share your thoughts on all of these cards down below. So much stuff to look at and think about and talk about. Some pretty cool designs this time. I like this a lot. Also, I think some really, really high powered designs. I had to rank these, but I literally think like the top 9 or 10 cards are all like kind of competitively viable stuff. Particularly the top 5 or 6, I think, could be very, very good stuff. So anyway, share those thoughts down below. Thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.